All right, great. Thank you very much. So, hello, everybody, and hello, Romania. So, this is a talk about when I was originally writing this talk, I was racking my brain because I was calling it Modern Catalyst. And I asked some other people what they thought Modern Catalyst was. And I got, people ask me questions, comparing Catalyst to other frameworks and so forth. So I'd like to try to, I like to try to get us on a similar page. So I'd like to take the first 2-3 minutes and just if you could turn to the person in the room next to you and tell them what you think Modern Catalyst is. And then that person tells you what they think Modern Catalyst is. And then after a minute or two, I'd like to hear what you came up with. And then I'll tell you what I think, and then we can all kind of try to get to the same place. So let's just take 2 minutes and turn to the person next to you and talk about what you think Modern Catalyst is. It only has to be 1 or 2 sentences. And if you think it's not modern, you can say, I don't think it's modern. That's fine too. Let's do that now. It sounds like it's getting a little quieter in the room. You want another moment, or you ready to hit me with your worst? Okay, it sounds like you're ready. So let me hear from somebody. Let's say somebody. I don't know. Are there at least 3 rows in this room? How many rows are in there of chairs do we have here? Oh, we only have 1. Oh, okay. All right, who's ever sitting furthest from the computer? You tell me what is Modern Catalyst? I think I heard a lot of complaints, so feel feel free to mention those as well. Nobody can decide who the furthest person away is. You should all turn around and look at that person. Sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah, perfect. Yes. Okay. All right. So modern catalyst might be something that's I don't know. It's just using JavaScript. Okay, great. So we'll look at two applications today. One will be like a classic application, like old style, everything handled on the server side, and we'll also spend a few minutes looking or some time looking at an application that's an API, right? So maybe that might cover part of it. That's good. All right, who else? Somebody in the middle of the room. You guys must have had like quite a lunch. You're tired. Most integration. So what does that mean? I mean, why does that make it modern? Okay, great. So a modern catalyst is using Moose or a modern approach to creating objects rather than the old style where where you're blessing everything and doing a lot of marshalling by hand. Okay, good. Let's hear from somebody else who's ever like on the right side of the person that just spoke. You tell me, what is modern catalyst? There's nobody on the right side of the last person that spoke, then the left side. I'm sorry, can you speak up? Sorry, can somebody repeat that who's a little closer to the computer? No? Okay, well, all right, I've heard a couple of different things, so Catalyst has been around for about 10 years, right? And over the time, it's had a lot of changes. I've heard somebody talked about the Moose integration. A number of years ago, we integrated PSGI. Who here is familiar with PSGI or Plaque? Whoever said, well, what is PSGI? Okay, great, right. So PSGI it was a standard for building web applications where you can separate the where you can more carefully separate how the application works from the underlying engine. So in the past, it was common. A lot of people were using mod Perl, right, which is Perl that's embedded into Apache. For a period of time, that was like the way you built Perl applications, right? Particularly in the 90s. You always use mod Perl, right? Then later on, we came to realize, although mod Perl is great for certain kinds of things, actually embedding the application directly into the web server didn't always promote stability, and then there were other downsides, like it was hard to upgrade Perl, and it was quite often hard to install modules, and so forth. So it became more common to say use fast CGI, right? And then some people wanted to build applications directly on top of web servers like Starman or Gazelle. Does everybody here know what have played with Starman? Do you know what that is? So it's just a web server that it basically listens to the PSGI protocol. Okay, so PSGI is another part of modern Catalyst. But so I mean, I've heard a lot of technologies, right? There's Moose, PSGI, and different things. But what I'm hoping to get to is let's look at a couple applications and talk about it, okay? And then maybe at the end of the presentation, we can ask ourselves the question again, what do we think modern Catalyst is? And maybe we might have some different ideas, okay? So, let's see, let me go to a browser. So, I was playing around with this website called todomvc.com. I was looking actually for a JavaScript framework to play with. And I thought this was actually sort of neat. Has anybody seen this? todomvc.com? If you haven't, it's worth taking a look at because even if you're doing Perl, you're probably going to be also doing some JavaScript on the front end or needing to support it. Anyway, this website, todomvc.com, was just a website where various JavaScript frameworks all implemented the same application, which is just like a to-do application. And you can sort of like, add stuff. And then this runs like on the client side, right? And then when you're done with something, you can check it off and you can remove it and so forth. So I thought to myself, and it's great, it's nice because you can then compare, under the hood, how the different JavaScript frameworks implement the same application. So you can sort of look around and try to get an idea of how to do things. And I thought it might be fun to take like a number of hours and see how far I could get building this application with Catalyst, but using like old style, everything running on the server. So not a fancy one-page application first. Just build it on the server and see how far I could get doing that. Let's close this. So I went ahead and I worked on that. I put it on GitHub. So let me talk a little bit about some of the things that I did here. So can you all see this, or is this not big enough? Somebody shout, oh, hello? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Was that okay? It's fine? Okay, great. All right, so when I started to build the application, what was the first thing that I did? The very first thing that I did was I didn't think about just building Catalyst, right? When you're building a modern Catalyst application or any sort of modern application, you really need to think a little bit about the life cycle of your application as it moves through the various stages, from development to QA into production, and how all that gets managed. In the modern development world, I think developers need to spend a lot more time thinking about how their application gets deployed, right? So one thing that I've been doing a lot lately is using Vagrant to build a local virtual machine and then running my app, doing my development inside of that. Anybody use Vagrant? I think I heard a yes. Did I hear a yes? Okay, what's Vagrant? Can you tell us to the people who maybe are not familiar with it? Right, I mean, it's basically just a tool for managing virtual machines on your local computer. Now, what's nice about it is that when you create a virtual, it lets you basically create a virtual machine based on a pre-existing image. And I think that as you think about when you build your application and you're going to put it onto different environments, you should think about creating a base image that's going to then live in different environments, right? That way you can sort of nail down how your application works. So let's quick look at a Vagrant file. This is just a very simple one. So in Vagrant, you configure the they call it a box. The box is just a virtual machine image, right? I've created a Vagrant box that I've used for a number of applications. It's just a Ubuntu server. Not my favorite, but a lot of people seem to know Ubuntu and are willing to support it. Sometimes I use Debian, just pure Debian, depending on the company I'm working with, okay? But this Ubuntu server is been set up, and I've installed the things that I normally use, whether it's Postgres and whatever tools that I'm using. And I've taken that virtual machine and frozen it and placed it onto the Vagrant website. So one of the things that a lot of times people have trouble with when using Perl and you're installing dependencies from CPAN, a lot of times those CPAN dependencies have C or C++ libraries that are required, right? And then you're trying to figure out, like I got to install those pieces, and you're trying to manage your application dependencies, but you're also needing to manage your operating system and your operating system dependencies. So I think it's a good tool for managing your operating system dependencies, and that whatever script, whatever tool you're using to build your Vagrant box, you should be using the same tool to build your QA and production images. So whether that's a tool like whether you're using Chef or Ruby or Ansible, these are all all DevOps tools basically. They're used to build and provision servers, right? So whatever tool you're using, whatever tool your company chooses or whatever one you like, okay? Or if you're using a tool like Packer from HashiCorp, these are all tools that are used to build virtual machine or build containers. Choose one, use it to build your box, and use the same setup to build your development environment as you're going to be building your QA or production environment, right? That way you have a consistent and repeatable environment across all the stages of your application. So in Vagrant, when you start with Vagrant, you can run a little bit of you can run some scripts to do provisioning. Generally, I try to do all my provisioning. When we say provisioning, that means set up the server to run your application. For the most part, I like to do all my provisioning using the tool that built the image. But okay, since when you're developing, you quite often need some extra stuff to develop that you don't put onto production. Like C compilers and things that don't belong on production but belong in a development environment. I will run a little bit of provisioning tools on my local development server through Vagrant in order to set up the development environment in a way that works for developers. So let me pause for a moment. Does anybody have questions about the idea of using Vagrant or what I just talked about building images for your application? It's a good question. Actually, I really thought about converting this over to Docker, and I ran out of time, but it actually doesn't matter. Docker is a specification for describing containers, concerning applications that run as containers, right? The container, whether your container is a Docker image or whether it's like with Vagrant, a full virtual machine, okay? I actually don't think it matters very much what you choose to do. A lot of companies now are looking at Docker because Docker it allows you to run more than one image on the same underlying virtual machine or machine. So it's good for doing things like when you want to create an image that's just, say, your Postgres server, and then you create an image that might be your front-end web server. Maybe you're using Nginx or Apache on the front end, and then you might have an separate image for your application, right? So the idea is no matter what you're doing, whether you're whether you're building a monolithic virtual machine for doing your deployments, or for managing your deployments, or whether or not you're breaking up your application into separate containers. It's just whatever's working for you and your company. What I'm suggesting here is that when you're thinking about what is a modern Perl application, you shouldn't just be thinking about, well, what is modern Perl, or what does the code look like? You need to be thinking about what is a modern way to do development in a way that does development, QA, production, and manages your entire life cycle, okay? So if you like Docker and you've used it, by all means, that's fine. Some people don't like it because it's a bit of a Jenga stack if it's not put together properly. But it's fine because if you're using Docker, if you're using, say, like Amazon Elastic Container Service, you can actually deploy your Docker container directly to Amazon to the container service and then scale it that way. If you're using Vagrant with a full virtual machine, it's a little more complicated because your tool that's building the Vagrant box would also need to build an Amazon AMI, which is an Amazon machine image, or if you're using if you're not using Amazon, if you're using, whatever you're using, you need to build the image for the separate environment. So it makes your build process maybe a little more complicated because your eventual target image is going to be a little different. It's going to be a different specification, right? So, like, again, you might build a virtual machine, like an Ubuntu virtual machine that's got all the things in it that you need for your application, and then in the end, you need to convert that virtual machine either to a Vagrant box for development or to an Amazon AMI for deploying to Amazon, or maybe you might be sending it to Azure. So Azure's got a specification for describing their virtual machines. So there's an end step, right? That's a little different for the three. That's why I think a lot of people are looking at Docker, because Docker is nice because you create a Docker container and then you just run it in your different environments without having to do that last step of converting it to prepare it to run on your environment. Did I answer that question well enough? Does anybody have a follow-up? Okay, so again, like in my mind, when I'm talking about what is a modern application, even before you start to write Perl, a modern application means thinking about how your application is going to run. You just don't turn on your computer and start, writing an application on your local desktop. You need to think about the entire life cycle in the modern world in order to get your application into the different environments and shared properly, so that you're not building an application on your laptop and then spending a month trying to figure out how to deploy that application, right, into your different environments. So I think I heard a question, or is are you just talking to each other? All right, so now, so I've talked about creating an environment, again, whether it's Vagrant or Docker or other machines. Sorry, there was a question? I guess I'm just getting chatter. Okay, all right, so I'm sorry, what was that? Okay, great, thank you. Sorry. Write your lists of your, the things that you use for your application. I think I lost you guys. Hello? Yeah, I was going to say, I think I lost you guys. Here, let's see if I can get it back running. Okay. One thing that would be great is can there be somebody to take the job of, if there's a question, to like shout out, because I might, I think I hear some talking and I'm not sure whether it's questions or not. So if there's a question, somebody just interrupt me, okay? Thank you. Let me share the screen again. Okay, so a CPAN file. Now, I know in the old days, we all used makefile.pl, and that's totally fine still. But generally, people are not deploying their Catalyst applications as CPAN modules. Like when I originally started doing, when I was doing Catalyst, when I would deploy my Catalyst application, I would actually bundle it and make it like as though it were a CPAN module, bundled together into a tarball, and then send that to my production, image, unpack it, and then replicate it across the environment. That was fine in the past, but in the modern time, most applications are not just your Catalyst. When you're building an application today, it's usually your Catalyst application is just one part of it, right? You're just not, it's just a lot more going on in deploying your modern application. So I tend to use CPAN file rather than the old style like, Makefile. Some people like Dizilla. You can use Dizilla as well. It requires more dependencies to be installed, that's all. But CPAN file is just a nice way of declaring the things that you need for your application. And a lot of times, I just, if you look, I just use the same CPAN file over and over again. Usually the things that I build for Catalyst is just the same things that I use to describe here. And the thing, a nice part about it is that it makes it easy to describe the things that you need different in your testing environment versus your development environment. So like on my development environment, I install Act and DVLD Warn and a couple other tools that are useful for development, but you don't need on production. Okay, so I'm using CPAN file right now for describing my Perl application dependencies. And when I also use a Makefile that I use to manage my local development environment, and this will just be on GitHub. You can feel free to look at it, crib it, copy it, whatever. But I like to have a Makefile local for doing things like starting the server or installing dependencies, because when you have, again, I'm looking to be able to make sure that I have an approach, a scripted approach to installing stuff that can be called from my automation scripts, right? So like when your application, when you're building your image for production, you're starting with that base image, right? You're putting your application onto it, installing your dependencies into it, and then you're then freezing that image again and putting it into your different environments. So that way, as you move through your development lifecycle from your development box to your QA box to your eventual production server or whatever stages you might have in between, you want to be able to have a scripted approach to repeatably installing your setup. All right, so we've been talking now for 20 minutes and we haven't even looked at Perl code yet, okay? I did that on purpose because I really want to emphasize to the group that building a modern application is not just about what your Perl code looks like. It's about thinking deeply about what your life cycle for your application is. So let's look at some stuff. Okay, so let's see. I was talking about the MVC, right? So I built last night a Catalyst application that did a part of what the MVC, to-do MVC website did. Oops, I broke it. All right, so let's look at the code for this. For those of you who may have read the Catalyst book with the tutorial, inevitably you start with the using the scaffolding tool to sort of build a template framework. I generally don't anymore myself because the scaffolding tools are they're great. They're nice for demo, I suppose, but it's sort of like a thing you do once, and I just think that it's not something to really to get hung up on, right? So usually when I build an a Perl Catalyst application, I create a CPAN like setup, with a testing directory, a lib directory. I don't have a makefile.pl. I just use CPAN file, and I create a subclass, a Catalyst application subclass. Usually I call it web.pm. Lately I've been calling it app.pm because calling things app is the cool thing to do now. But it doesn't matter. I just make it a subclass. And I often just make something simple that looks like this. So let's go through it. I just show you, create the name of the application. These are the plugins that I generally use nowadays. Not a lot of plugins. I use Config Loader because Config Loader is a nice way of making it easy to do configuration that's different between your different environments. Now, let's talk about Config Loader. When I was first doing Catalyst applications, quite often I would create a development, QA, and production configuration and actually check it into the repository, right? That was part of the website. Since in the modern process for developing applications, quite often you're using other tools like, whether it's like Chef or Ansible or whatever, that's building your various environments. I usually don't check those things into the Catalyst application anymore, and I build my local target configuration using those tools instead. Okay, I just find that it ends up playing better with the kind of tools that your DevOps team might be comfortable with. And otherwise, I just have a few other plugins. The way that Catalyst does redirection is a little complicated because when you set up a redirect in Catalyst out of the box, it doesn't actually quite do what people think that it does, which is it sets up a redirect and does a decache and all that. So I just have a redirect plugin that I like to use, and I have a little wrapper around the tool used to create URI. So those are, I'm not using a ton of plugins, it's just a handful. And really Config Loader is the one that I use that is the most valuable one. So here's some bits that you may not have seen before if you worked on Catalyst applications in the past. Injecting components. So one thing that people often tell me that they have trouble with or they don't like about Catalyst is that you have to create a lot of classes in order to have a basic application. Okay, so for example, if you're building a Catalyst application and you're using DBX class, so you need to create a model for the DBX class adapter that adapts your DBX class schema and brings it into Catalyst. Personally, I don't think that it's a big deal because it's a one-time cost to build, the extra model. But in the newer versions of Catalyst, you can actually just simply inject components into your Catalyst application via configuration. Okay, so you don't actually, if you want to just create a schema model that's based on Catalyst model DBase schema, which is pointing to your DBase class stuff, you can just simply inject it directly with using configuration in this manner. You'll probably need the subclass later on someday when you need to do you need to override it or do configuration. But it just makes it a little bit easier to get started. A lot of people also ask me, where do I put configuration for Catalyst in the modern context? What I usually do is I will put configuration into my, what I call the application subclass, right? So when I say application subclass, I'm talking about this. The class where I said use Catalyst, right? Because that creates a subclass of Catalyst.pm, and that's your application container. So when I say application subclass, I'm talking about this, okay? I put all my configuration that's the same across all environments into the application subclass under package config. And anything that's different between environments, I will put into a configuration file, a local configuration file that's part of that's in the root of the application, and then that's it. So that's this is how I separate it. Everything that's the same across the application goes here. Everything that's different goes into the local configuration file that's on the root of the application. And again, that local file, I actually don't put that into the repository. I let my DevOps team, or if I'm doing my own DevOps, I actually build that file using whatever automation tools that I've chosen or been forced to use for the application. Again, whether it's Chef or a bunch of bash scripts, or if using Ansible, any of those things. Okay, so that's why I put that together. So I'm using DBase class, and I tend to use DBase class, which is a tool for describing how your database works. I know that a lot of newer applications are using like NoSQL databases and other types of database stores. I just keep finding that I end up going back to a database for anything real. So when I do that, I'm using DBase class. Generally, when I'm using DBase class, I create a schema subclass. I actually really don't like the convention that everybody calls a DBX class schema, my app schema, or whatever, because I just think calling it, I think it should be called what your domain is called. But at this point, every application that I've seen that uses DBase class, almost everybody calls it schema. So I just do that because I get this sort of like, I don't want to go against the flow. If people are expecting to see it, then I just do that. I would prefer a different convention, but it's pretty well established. And I also use Drew wrote some DBase class schema helpers that I think make using DBase class a little bit better. I'm not going to go into detail about how I'm using DBase class for the purposes of this conversation, but feel free to look at my look at the GitHub repo and just, if you want to just crib my stuff, that's fine. So let's look at. So for the to-do application, I just have one table, and it looks like this. It just got the three fields: the name of your to-do item, position, and completed. I copied this from, if you go to the To-Do MVC website, they actually sort of have a specification for how this stuff is supposed to work, so I just copied it and brought it over. I then used, a little bit. I then used DBAX class migration to use DBAX migration as a tool for setting up my migrations. So let's see, I can pull it open so you can see it here. All right, so there's a migrations directory and a fixtures directory. DBAX class migration is a tool that's built on top of DBAX deployment handler that's intended to add a little bit of consistency and sugar to deployment handler, which is kind of a low-level tool. It's a great tool, but it's a little bit of a low-level tool. DBAX class migrations is on CPAN, and it's got an extensive tutorial of its own. So I'm just going to go over it in slight detail. But when you use DBAX class migrations, it creates a migrations directory and a fixtures directory, and your migrations will just be versions. I'm using SQLite for this demo because it's just easy to use. But if you're using Postgres or if you're using MySQL, whatever, it'll create directories based on that, and it'll create one version. It'll create a version for each version of your database. I only have one version right now, and it creates a SQL file that basically does the install. So if I was to change the database and create a version of it, it would then create it would actually create a diff that would allow you to perform the migration forward. A lot of people are using Skitch, which is also a great tool that's not tied to DBAX class. So if you're not using DBAX class, or if you think deployment handler looks too complicated, you can do something else. Again, when you're thinking about your application, I can't emphasize enough. Don't just think about writing the code. You need to be thinking about the holistic process. And that includes building the server where your application is going to run, and keeping track of how your system changes over time, right? So whether you're using DBAX class migrations, or you're building something directly on top of DBAX deployment handler, or using Skitch, maybe you rolled your own tool. I don't recommend rolling your own tool, but if you did, you did. You need to have a mechanism for describing how your application changes over time in a way that is repeatable, okay, and in a way that is easy to set up, so that when you want to build a new server, it's not like when you want to set up a new server, it doesn't take somebody a week. I remember in the 90s, even in the early aughts, the process of deploying a new server for a company was complicated, right? They would get a new box and they would have to set it up, and then run a bunch of bash scripts and do a bunch of manual installations, try to get the server set up properly. In the modern time, you need to be able to say, I can take my application and deploy it to 1,000 servers, by running a few scripts. You really need to be thinking about that. If you had to put your application on 100,000 servers, how would you do it, right? It should be the same process for deploying it to one server. Should be the same process that you would use to deploy it basically to 100,000 or 10,000 servers, whether it's on Amazon or Azure, or you have a huge in-house setup. Okay, so let's talk about the creating your image for running your application. We've talked about your database and your migrations. We haven't really talked about Catalyst yet, so let's talk a little bit about Catalyst. All right, so we already looked at the application subclass. which is where, as I say, I put configuration that's the same across all applications. So when most people think of Catalyst, they think of their controllers, right? So let's look at the controller directory. And we'll look at the root controller. All right, so here is how I've tried to sort of put this application together. I've created a root controller, and this might look a little different from the controllers that get built by the scaffold. I tend to use MooseX methods attributes directly rather than trying to do some begins a block around the extends. This is how I generally do it because I think it comes out nice and clean. And I'm also using chaining. Okay, so let me talk about how the chaining works. And let's just start the application so you can see it. All right, so can we see the debug output? I'm just going to assume that's the case. Okay, so when you start your Catalyst application in debug mode, it gives you a list of the controllers that you've made and how everything is mapped together, right? So your path specification, that's going to be the URL that the controller in action is listening to. And on the right side, this is the description of what actually happens behind the scenes, okay? Unfortunately, the sorting for how this works could be better. Really, these two endpoints should be next to each other. Basically, there's two paths to the root of your application. One is a get, and one is a post. So when you do get to the root of your application, it hits the root action, and then it's the summary action, and it hits the view action. When it's a post, in other words, it's a mutation, it's following again, it's going to root, summary, and then add. So let's look at the code for that. All right. When using chaining, you'll often end up with a lot of methods that don't have a lot of stuff in it. In fact, you might have some methods that are empty. And I always tell people that's totally fine. In fact, I encourage that. The nice thing about using chaining is that it allows you to break up your application into small discrete parts. And even though my root chain action has nothing in it today, it will certainly have things in it in the future. For example, in the future, I might choose to add authentication or authorization, and then in which case I might need to add some stuff to the root in order to do things like check to see if somebody's logged in, and if not, send them to the login page, right? So if you're finding when you're using chaining that you're creating a lot of actions that don't have a lot of stuff, you're actually, in my mind, using it properly. Okay. So here's the root action. And when you're doing chaining, your root chain is always this, chain slash. It's just a convention. Might have been better if it was called root chain or something like that. I've actually experimented with like 5 different ways to add sugar on top of the core chaining syntax, and I've never come up with anything that was demonstrably better than what Matt Trout came up with on day one, or I don't know how long he thought about it. But in any case, the chaining syntax that comes with Catalyst is a little bit verbose, but if you use it carefully, you shouldn't have any problems building complicated chains that work the way you want them to work. Okay. So, anybody have a question about the root chain? Pat? Okay, so the question is, like, let's say you had an error here. Out of the box, unfortunately, and then this probably wasn't by design, but out of the box, if you create if there's an error in your chain and it happens here, Catalyst will just continue to like execute each remaining chain item. There's actually a configuration. Let me go to CPAN. Now, I couldn't fix this as a default option because I was afraid that it would break too much backward compatibility. But there is a configuration option that should say, let's see. I don't remember the name of it. It's here. Okay. So if you go to Catalyst and you look at your configuration options, there's actually quite a few configuration options. There's a number of them that are here because as we've changed Catalyst over the past 10 years, quite often we ran into a situation where we wanted something that was different, but we couldn't make that the default behavior because we didn't want to break backward compatibility. So there's a option here called abort chain on error fix. And if you simply use this in your configuration, that will solve that problem. Actually, we could probably make this default. I don't know. It might be worth talking about on the Catalyst channel. We could probably make this, we could probably say abort chain on error default and then give somebody an option to switch it back to the old behavior. But right now, yes, you could fix that by just simply sending this configuration option in your, and you would put this in your application subclass, abort chain on error fix equals 1. And then what would happen is when there was an error at any point in your chain, it would actually detach at that point and stop. Does that answer the question? No problem. Hey, look, if you've been using Catalyst for like 8 years and you haven't gone and looked at the current Catalyst documentation, if you had, you really need to. I mean, just to go into it, you really need to look at the delta, because that kind of describes the major changes between different versions, okay? And you really need to look at the change log because there have been a lot of like little tweaks, particularly over the last 5 years, and it's very likely we may have solved the problem that you've been having, and you just didn't know about it. So, like, if you're using Catalyst on the job and you haven't read like the Catalyst like delta or changes or the documentation changes that have happened, you know, particularly things around how we do UTF-8 and so forth. Also, I would look at Catalyst upgrading as well. Delta contains like most of the differences. The upgrading is it just gives you hints about like if you're upgrading an old Catalyst application. In general, Catalyst really focuses on trying to be backwards compatible, but in some cases, we have deprecated things over time, right? And as time went on, we removed something and then said like, you know, here's how you do backward compatibility, right? And so when you upgrade your Catalyst application, you might need to, you know, set some configuration variables or something in order to keep compatibility. So, I mean, if you haven't looked at this, you really got to look at it because there have been changes. I mean, that particular problem that you just mentioned about like how the chaining, like, you know, doesn't abort properly. I mean, let's see, what version we changed again? That was changed in version 5900. So this was at, it would have gone live in, let's see. Okay, this problem was fixed like 2 years ago. Obviously, it's been a problem for you for probably, I don't know how long, but we had an option for you to not have that problem that went into 5970, okay? So it's worth looking at. All right, let's go back to it. Okay, so were there any other questions about the root chain? How am I doing on time here? All right, so we've been doing this about an hour. So let me go through the rest of this stuff. I want to leave time for talking about stuff. All right, so where were we? All right, so we were looking at what happens when you do a get. So it goes to the root action, it goes to the summary action, and then it goes to the view action. Okay, we added, I think, about 3 years ago, support. Was there a question or somebody just moving their chair around? Okay. I think it was about 3 years ago that we added support directly into Catalyst for being able to match on an HTTP method. So it's a little tricky because with chaining, when I do chaining, one thing I often do is, you see how I'm indenting here, right? So root is here at basically no indenting. Now summary is chained off of root, and I indented it once. This is something that I personally do because I find that it helps me understand what actions are underneath other actions. I know it's not a standard Perl thing to indent your top-level subroutine, but I do it because, again, it's a nice visual cue that tells me that, like, I know right away that summary is under root. So you see how I'm doing that? It's a convention you can adopt or not. Some people think it's stupid. Some people like it. Okay. So summary is chained off of root, and what's going on here? So the reason why I broke this particular set of actions up into 3 separate chains is that this is the intended flow. I'm hitting the root of the controller. I'm preparing a view, and then depending on whether or not the view, whether or not the request is a get or a post, if it's a get, I'm simply going to display the view. But if it's a post, I need to validate the post parameters. And if the post parameters are valid, I want to show the view. And if they're not valid, I want to do some sort of error handling, right? Now, I think it's worth like dwelling on this because this particular setup, right? It's almost like a design pattern for Catalyst applications. And because it's the kind of thing you do a lot of. So I recommend that, like, when you go to put something together, like, look at what I've done here, think about it, and because it's such a common pattern, find an approach, whether it's my approach or a different approach, that works for you, and use it repeatedly, because it'll help you with your work. Okay, so here's the let's talk about the view action. So this might look a little different from some applications that you've used in Catalyst. But quite often in Catalyst, we use the view to get information from the database, and then we take the information from the database, we put it into the stash, and then we call the view. The view then inspects the stash and does some stuff. Okay. One thing that I found over time now is that this putting things into the stash, it leads to a lot of problems because the way the stash works, it's just sort of like a hash, right? So it's very prone to typos, and because it's just a hash as opposed to a class, you really don't have validation on it, okay? What I prefer to do in my more modern applications is to actually build a view. Was there a question about the stash? Okay, can you repeat it, please? Thank you. Okay. Yes, go ahead. I'm using the view like a stash, yes. Except, let's go look at my, at this actual view, the summary view. Let me pull it open. Okay, can you see this? Okay, so what am I doing here? Okay, with the view, all right. And again, this might be something you don't like, but I want you to think about it. What in Catalyst applications like from 2006, okay, or so forth, we often put stuff into the stash and then sent it to the view. We generally had, if you're using, say, like the template toolkit view, which was very popular, you had one view, right? Well, we called it a view. It's really more like a template factory, okay, although we put it in the view directory. You have one view, and that view would then look at the stash and look at your request, and then go find a template and do a bunch of work, right? Something that I've been playing with a lot lately is the idea of having a view that actually encapsulates the information about that view, right? So here, I've created a subclass of Catalyst View Template Pure, which is a new view that I've been working on this year. And I honestly do consider it sort of like a beta thing, okay? But whether or not you use Template Pure or you look at the ideas behind it, what I'm doing here is I'm saying, instead of creating one like view and then a bunch of templates, I'm creating a view per, basically a view that's per template, okay? I'm using Moose, and I'm actually making tasks, as you can see here on line number 8. It's actually a required field for the view, okay? Now, here I just simply said that it's required, which means that if I go to call the view and I don't send it the stuff that's wanted, I'll get a runtime error. You could actually, since you're using Moose, you could even put a type constraint on it and say that it has to be something, it has to be a database class result set, right? I didn't do that here just for the purposes of demo, but there's nothing stopping you, okay? And when you go back to look at, let's pull up the controller, okay? Like if I had like misspelled tasks, how many people have used a stash and had a spelling error in their stash, right? And then that screwed up your template and you spent half the day trying to figure it out. Raise your hand. How many hands have gone up? 2? Okay, that's fewer than usual. People are being shocked. I mean, it's very often the case in one of the more common problems with the two very common problems with the stash. People make typos, right? So the template is got, there's in the template it's saying tasks, and in the controller you're saying tasks, and then you're like, how come it's not working? And you're driving me so crazy. So you have a typo, okay? Or you just didn't put the information in, right? Your model didn't return anything for some reason, and then your template's not working. So if you're, and again, it's just thinking about it, like, one of the things that I always say that modern Catalyst should be is we should be responding and trying to fix problems that we've all had, right? So I've seen people using the stash and have it go bad a lot, right? You have people have typos, the variables aren't defined. Quite often the stash gets super complicated. Like I've worked at companies where they've had wiki pages where, like, where you had they had a wiki page for their application that made a list of everything that was expected to be in the stash because people got confused as to what was in the stash, right? You know, it just becomes like a dumping ground. So what I'm trying to say here is, like, if that's been a problem, maybe we can come up with a different way of calling our view and try to solve that problem. What I'm proposing is, let's make our views strongly typed views that expect their data and do validation on the data by using what comes with Moose. I mean, earlier at the beginning of this conversation, I asked the group, tell me what is Modern Catalyst. Somebody said, well, it's using Moose. Well, quite often people were not using Moose properly, right? Here I've created a view that's using Moose, that's declaring the attributes that are required, and putting some constraints on it. Now, I'm simply saying it's required, but you could put a type constraint on it saying it needs to be a DBX type route. Okay? So this is solving a specific problem that people have. Question? Okay, great. So, when I say, like, this is an idea, it may be a bad idea. Yeah. So in this particular, again, I think when trying to think about what are problems that we had, obviously the idea you may not be the best ones, right? So what I propose is making the view more strongly typed, but yes, and it's a great point, right? Because, like I said, the idea may be a bad one, and we might need to, like the idea that would seem like a good idea to me when I share it with other people obviously has some flaws, right? And that's part of the conversation about how to improve it. So let me explain how it works, okay? Because part of this is knowing how Catalyst works, right? And one thing that I've noticed is that even though Catalyst has been around for 10 years, I think there's not a lot of understanding about how Catalyst components and the different ways the Catalyst system can work, okay? I'll explain how this works here, and then hit me with your questions about it. So when I call the view, and I'm sending it some argument, behind the scenes, it's actually going and calling new, right? Now, if for some reason, okay, let me just explain how it works here and then explain the different ways, other ways that it could work. When I'm calling it here, I'm calling new, and I'm verifying that it's all good. But I'm actually not generating a response, right? That's pretty clearly the case. Okay, I've created an object that's been properly populated, but I haven't actually said, let's build a response. I'm doing that here because both the view and the add action both chain off this summary action, right? So I actually have two endpoints for this particular view. One is a get, and one is a post. With the post, I need to do some additional work, right? I need to do some validation and add stuff to the database and so forth. And if there's errors, I'm doing something different. Okay, so that's why I created the view here. Okay, because I'm going to be reusing it in two places. Okay, but then here you might be saying, well, I'm calling the view. How come I don't need to, how do I know that it's already created? So it's just that when the way Catalyst works is when you call for something, and it does accept context, okay? It creates the view, but this particular view is when it's created, it then stores itself as part of the context, so that every time you call it after the first time, you're actually getting the one that was already created. Okay, let me just sort of repeat that. The first time that I'm called this view, it builds it. The second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh time you've called the view, it just simply returns the one that's already been built for this request. Now, when the next request comes in, because the life cycle of this particular component is scoped to the application. It's not scoped to the application, it's scoped to the context. Okay? So because it's scoped to the context, it will build the first time, and then it will return it the second, third, fourth, fifth time. That way, I can then call methods against it. Does that make sense, or should I go into more detail? Okay, but again, it's like sometimes when you're building Catalyst applications, one of the problems that I think people face is that you Catalyst has a lot of its own stuff that you need to understand, right? And so that's, I think, in a way, it's a barrier for it. But just to be really clear, accept context, and this has been around for I don't know, I don't know when Matt Traub put it in, but I think it's at least since 2007, right? So for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, but we've been around for 10 years, but we haven't always built up in our community really good examples that have helped us to sort of I don't know, build upon the ideas that we have, right? So that's what I'm doing here. I know that, if you've never seen it before, it might seem a little confusing, but I think once you understand it, I'm hoping that it starts to make sense, okay? And so if for some, again, I'm avoiding using the stash a lot because I find that it has problems. Just for whatever it's worth, you can actually use the stash with Catalyst View Template Pure. What'll happen is when you go the first time that you call the view, it will grab things out of the stash and use that as part of the initialization. Okay, so if you have say 5, 6, 7, if you say you have a bunch of chained actions, and you need to build things up the way you used to by using the stash, you can continue to do that. I think that it does give you a little bit of extra protection because when it actually builds the view and it grabs things out of the stash, if the stash is not set up the way it expects, you'll get a runtime error, right? So it's a little safer. Okay. Yes, we're running low on time. It's always like this. Catalyst is really difficult to demo because it's complicated enough, that it doesn't make a pretty demo in the way that some frameworks do. Okay. What time is it? All right, let's look at the post action and go into it in detail, and then we'll break, and I'll give you guys some chance to ask me some questions. So when I do a get, let's see. So I think I wrote this code earlier today, right? Let's fix it together. It's always fun. Okay. So how did I break it? So here's the get, right? It's giving me the list of to-dos, and it's adding things to the database. You can see it running here. So I hit the root action, I hit the summary action, I hit the view action. That's then calling my view, my summary view, and it's calling render on it, so it's actually creating the response. Okay, that's what's happening there. Now let us do a post. And I know that I broke this, so let's see what I broke, and let's see if we can fix it together with our remaining time here. Oh, I didn't break it. All right, so there it is here. Let's look at how it works. So again, when you're working with Catalyst, it's just getting this nice debug output is very useful. There's a form here that's sending it's just sending one parameter title, right? And it has the value that I typed in. Again, it's calling the root action. Again, it's calling the summary action. But instead of calling the view action, it's calling the add action. Let's look at the add action. Okay, so that's this right here, this piece. All right. So data is coming in, it's post, okay? I'm matching it because I have a post attribute, right? Question? Okay, so where am I getting my my form parameters from? I've created a model that's specifically for the purpose of actually modeling how I'm doing validation. And I've placed that model, I've proxied that model into Catalyst so that I can just grab it and use it as I want. So let's look at, real quick, let's look at this form. I'm using form handler because even though there's some things about it that I don't like, it's pretty robust at this point, and I know the author, so if I have problems with it, I can get it to fix things. Okay. So, question? Okay, so with HTML form handler, I describe my field. So here's the title field with some information about it. It's required and so forth. I know a lot of people, when using HTML form handler, there's like a trait for form handler to hook things up to DBX class. I personally don't use it because I find that it causes more trouble than it solves. I generally just create my own update model method for like if it validates and it's correct, you want to actually take that information and either put it into the database if it's new, right, or update the database, right? I end up creating my own update model, and it very often looks like this. I get the values that have been posted. Update model gets called only if it's valid, right? Item is going to be the DBX class row. It's either a new row if it's a new, or it's if it's an existing row that you're updating, it's that. I kind of wish that Gerda had called item model instead, because for some reason it just doesn't jump out at me, but that's what she called it. And I'm just updating. So this item here, that's actually the DBX class row. Okay. And I like to call the actual setter method directly rather than sending everything to insert because that way it's a better abstraction. Later on, if you change your database model, you can get backward compatibility by doing things like creating these methods. And then, so I'm setting my values, and I call insert or update because I don't know whether it's a new one or it's a one we're updating, right? Let's go back to the code before we run out of time here. All right. So I have my model, my form model. I'm calling it. In this case, I need to send it a new result because it's new, right? In the case where I'm editing it, I would actually just send it the row that I found, right? And then I'm going to call, the form has a method called isValid, which tells you if it's valid or not. And if it's valid, I am just simply displaying it. And if it's invalid, I'm actually going to take that view and put an overlay on it and return that it's a bad request. I actually ran out of time when I was working on this, so I didn't do this part. But I promise that I will add this stuff and put it into GitHub sometime the next day or so you could look it over. And we're running out of time anyway, so let me just go back and again, I want to dwell on the pattern here, right? You know, when I'm using chain, I'm isolating the parts that are common, okay? The parts that are different, I'm making different, okay? So for the part that's a view, it's this. For the part that's mutating, it's that. I'm taking advantage of Catalyst to dependency injection, right? To make it so that I can call for models and program to an interface against an interface, rather than doing stuff like, you know, using the model, using the form in my controller, doing new in the controller. I see that a lot, and it's not really making best use of Catalyst, because you're at that point you're programming against an instance, right? So I always say, like, programming against an interface is always better, because you can then change the underlying object without breaking all your code, okay? That's just something to keep in mind. So we're a little short of time. I wanted to stop now and get questions about any of this stuff, or any random question about Catalyst that you want to ask. Okay, so if you don't have any questions now, but you want, or you're too shy to ask a question in public, I'm JNAP on the Catalyst IRC channel. If you don't know how to get onto IRC, I'm sure somebody else in the room does, and they'll be happy to help you. This application is on my GitHub account. I'll send the link around, but it's just under my GitHub, to do MVC. You can go to look at it and ask me questions about it. I want to answer the one question. Like, again, at the very beginning of this, I said, what is a modern Perl application? And we talked about technologies, you know, remotes, PSGI, and other things. For me, a modern Catalyst application, it's not just about Catalyst. There's really two things that I want you to think about. You're not just building an application, you're building a whole process, okay? A process, an application that needs to go to different environments. You need to deal with that, okay? So that's one part of a modern Catalyst application, is whether you're using Vagrant or Docker, or whether you're using Ansible or Chef or any of these other tools that are used for doing, you know, reliable and repeatable deployment, you got to use one of those things. That's the first thing. The second part of modern Catalyst is, I think that modern Catalyst is a conversation about what makes our applications better, okay? One thing that I've noted, and I've worked on a lot of Catalyst applications over the past 10 years at different companies, and it's a little discerning to me that I see a lot of the applications look exactly the same way as they looked in 2006, right? And some of the ideas in 2006 are great, but some of them were just like, this is the first idea that we had, let's try it, okay? And then for some reason we didn't continue to try things. The conversation should be, what works, what doesn't work, okay? What causes us trouble? If the stash is, for example, sometimes causing us trouble, Might there not be a different way to build applications in Catalyst? Okay, what might that look like? Let's try the idea. Okay, is the new idea better, or is it more confusing? If it's not better, let's continue the conversation and try to make it better. I'm really hoping that you walk away thinking that even though Catalyst is 10 years old and maybe it seems a little old and crusty, right? It's not agile, I don't know, whatever that means. It's really up to all of us to drive the conversation forward. If there's something about it that doesn't work, or if there's something about it that doesn't work as well as you would like, you have to try different things, and you have to take those different ideas and bring them into the community so that we can talk about them together, right? In this application, I've thrown out some new ideas about the way I think I like to build applications. I hope that those are ideas that are interesting to you. And if they're a little confusing to you, that's fine too, because I want you to think, all right? And I want you to give feedback. You can always send me pull requests or create issues. I think, is somebody speaking? Okay, great. Well, that's it. I appreciate everybody coming, and somebody's speaking, but I can't hear it. Can you repeat, please? Oh, you know what it is? When I'm talking, it seems like I'm getting echo feedback on myself, of course, the microphone. So I keep thinking that I'm asking myself a question. All right. Thank you all.